Well, I think it's just change, right? I mean, and the change is for the best part of 500 years, the global economic system has largely revolved around, single dominating centres, and those centres have, through a combination of control over technologies, control over militaries, and control over finances, have secured wealth from peripheral parts of the world to the economic and political elite in the centres of the world. That model is changing. That model is transforming, in part because of the 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 spreading out, if you will, of trading relationships, so that the centrality of the US economy to global trade, which was the case until a few decades ago, has now diminished substantially. Obviously, China has in large part become the most significant trading country in the world and is also the world's most significant industrial economy. But in doing that, it hasn't been able to, and I don't think structurally it can in any regards, replace the US in terms of one economic hegemon replacing another economic hegemon.
On this episode of the What the Finance podcast, I have the pleasure of welcoming back Warwick Powell. So Warwick is an adjunct professor at the Queensland University of Technology, sort of working at the intersection of China, digital technologies, supply chains, financial flows, and global political economy and governance. So, Warwick, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast.
Great to be back, Anthony.
No problem. I'm looking forward to the conversation. And I thought we'd start off where I think everyone's talking about at the moment is tariffs, and that's where we're talking on the 2nd of February, my time, 3rd of February, your time in Australia. And over the weekend, Trump has put tariffs on Mexico and Canada, and probably by the time this goes up, things may have changed. But really interested to hear, I guess, your perspective, what this means. China's also had some tariffs put on it as well. So yeah, how do you see this changing, I guess, trade globally?
Look, the first thing to note is that nobody should be surprised at the move to prioritise tariffs as both trade and geopolitical policy. This has been widely understood as central to Donald Trump's policy framework and his broader approach to how to govern the relationships between the United States and the rest of the world. The imposition of tariffs on products from Canada and Mexico, and to a lesser extent on China over the weekend, I think really lays open the broader questions around whether or not the fundamental nature of the global trading environment that has evolved over the last 70 years is going to sustain itself into the future. One of the issues that underpins all of this, Anthony, is that for many, many decades now, the United States has, in effect, been running an IOU tab with the rest of the world, whereby the rest of the world supplies the United States with a broad range of real economy value, whether it's in raw material terms or in manufactured products, whether they're intermediate products, capital goods, or finished products. And in exchange for that, the United States uses the United States dollar fundamentally as an IOU. The IOU is good for essentially exchanging for other things, including things that the United States produces and makes available. And the fundamental question now is whether or not that set of arrangements will be satisfactory for the rest of the world going forward. I would suggest that, in fact, the Trump tariffs ushers in an opportunity for a reconfiguration of global trading patterns, in large part extending and hastening the patterns that have already been evident over the last 10 to 15 years. So much so that through its own actions, the United States is likely to increase its own isolation from the global trading system in relative terms and hasten two other really important things. One is the intensification of trade amongst other nations, and on the back of that, the progressive decline in demand for US dollars. So that's the sort of, in my view, the bigger picture. The short-term picture will be obviously the adjustment impacts that the tariffs imposed on Canada and Mexico and the retaliatory measures that have been imposed by those respective governments will have on supply chains, enterprises, and different communities. And given the complexities of the supply chain interactions within the North American continent and into Central America, it's kind of hard to predict precisely what those impacts will be, but it certainly will be disruptive to how business has been done to date.
Yeah, I think it's definitely interesting to see. And do you see China, I guess, sort of retaliating as well to their smaller tariffs?
Look, China has indicated that it's opposed to the tariffs and that they will pursue the complaint through the World Trade Organization. Now, I think that that move in and of itself is interesting in a few respects. Firstly, it speaks to China's efforts to be seen through its deeds as a participant, as a responsible participant in in global institutions as they are. So pursuing the trade disputes through the WTO is a way of demonstrating that it remains committed to the fundamental foundations of multilateral trade in the world. The second thing that I think is interesting about this move is that it is a relatively measured response. It doesn't involve imposing reciprocal tariffs, and it certainly doesn't involve too much chest beating at the moment. So the approach that has come from Beijing, I think, reflects a number of things. Firstly, China is a nation that actually sees its interests as being tied to multilateral trading. In that regard, it understands the importance of institutions like the WTO and does not seek to pursue actions that will directly or indirectly or explicitly or implicitly undermine the importance of those institutions for multilateral trade going forward. In doing that, it's also making a very clear play, I think, for the hearts and minds of quite a number of nations that would, all other things being equal, be natural allies or historical allies of the United States, but whose economic livelihoods are fundamentally tied to the stability of multilateral trade. The second reason I think it's important is that I think China once again has demonstrated an approach to managing geopolitical affairs that is relatively measured. It tends not to react too quickly to events. It prefers to take its time to observe the fallout from interventions and changes to the system operating parameters, and to analyze how they will affect China's own interests in the short term, as well as affect its interests in the longer term. So I don't expect China to necessarily respond in a rapid tit for tat kind of way, but clearly it is signaling that it will take measured actions that seek to uphold global multipolarity in terms of trading institutions, and also, of course, reserve its right to take other actions as it sees fit. The last thing I might say on this front is that I think it also reflects a confidence from the administrators and the powers that be in Beijing that the structure and nature of China's economy domestically and its relationships with the economies of much of the rest of the world is strong enough to withstand the impact of tariffs and, in fact, to weather the storm.
Okay, yeah, a lot to unpack there. But I guess if we look at the thinking behind why the tariffs were implemented, do you see that there is this? If we look at, I guess, the majority of these domestic countries, a lot of them are very protectionist. I think China domestically for a lot of their production protectionist, Europe as well. I'm not too sure about South America. So it does seem to be that maybe it was a bit lopsided away from the US, and now this is trying to shift it, even if it's a very aggressive way of doing that. Do you sort of see the thinking behind that, or do you disagree?
Well, look, there is a way in which some people will frame the way nations make their decisions based on this notion of reciprocity, of how other nations make decisions. It seems kind of odd to me that a nation that speaks so often about being the most powerful nation in the world allows its own policy framework to be dictated by the decisions made by others. But be that as it may, it seems that the broader issues at stake isn't just this sort of loose idea of reciprocity that that the policies country A adopts should reflect the policies that country B adopts, which, as I mentioned, is an odd kind of approach to policy making, but is fundamentally reflective of a diagnosis of the American political economy malaise. And the diagnosis runs something like this: that the world has been taking advantage of the United States for decades by selling it things. And in that process, the United States no longer makes the things that it consumes. Therefore, the countries doing the selling are taking advantage of the US, and the US is now vulnerable to the rest of the world. And on that basis, the aim is to square the ledger. And so the obsessions become focused around ideas of trade balance, right? And as opposed to the ideas of improving material quality of living. And the idea as a result is that tariffs will somehow achieve a few things along that front. One, the idea is that it will increase the costs of imported goods, thereby reducing the amount of imports that the United States in this case will take. The second thing is that it assumes that the domestic response would be for local enterprises to boost output to substitute for the higher cost products that are now being imported. So as consumers in those countries buy less imported goods, they will turn their consumption expenditure capabilities to supporting local output. That's the theory. Now, we've already had about 6 years of observation in recent times as to whether or not that theory works in practice. And I'm talking about the effects of the tariffs imposed under the first Trump administration, and then, of course, the continuation of various trade restrictions and market access restriction policies under the Biden administration. And the evidence, I think, suggests that the imports don't stop. That's the first thing. And that the second thing is that the domestic industrial adjustment actually doesn't happen in the way that the theory would like it to happen. The consequence of that is that the policy tends to drive higher costs for those products that the tariffs have been imposed upon, which need to be offset by other kinds of policy measures to try to tame inflation overall. So this is the consequence of the imposition of tariffs on imported goods. The jobs did not return to the heartland during the course of 2018 through to 2021. They certainly didn't do so in the Biden years either. So whether or not this particular policy response is adequate to achieving the policy ambitions that the United States body politic has set for itself, I think is probably the big question mark. And the evidence so far would suggest that it's probably the wrong tool, given the objectives that the administration has set itself. And one of the reasons it's the wrong tool is because it is based on a questionable diagnosis of the reasons why the American political economy is structured the way that it is, and why manufacturing over the last 50 years has progressively hollowed out.
And what would you say are the reasons for that? Is just uncompetitiveness globally?
No, the fundamental structural reason over the last 50 years is the progressive expansion of finance capital as a sector that is far more attractive for the deployment of money capital compared to industrial capital. So industrial capital which is the world of factories and production processes and raw materials and things like that, has witnessed two big changes. One is progressive mechanization and automation, which is to take labour out where it can, so that labour can make a lesser claim on value added and therefore maintain a greater share of value added available for distribution to capital. The second reason or the second phenomenon associated with American manufacturing over the course of the last 50 years is where that automation was not feasible, the activity itself was relocated to places where labour costs were substantially lower. Now, the hollowing out of American manufacturing began in the 1960s, and for those two particular reasons that I've just described. And underpinning that has been the financial interests of finance capital, which is looking for much quicker ways of generating monetized profits, and it progressively takes its surpluses out of the real economy of manufacturing, production, and transformations, and commits that money capital into the markets of fictitious capital, shares, bonds, foreign exchange, derivatives trading, and the like. So over the course of the last 50 years, the financialized sector of the United States economy has grown substantially, and there is a cause and effect relationship between the growth of that sector and the progressive diminution of the manufacturing sector, both in terms of its contribution to gross domestic product as well as its contribution to employment. These are structural features where finance capital has become dominant at an economic level, but importantly also at a political level, whereby policy changes have been instituted over that period of time, which have increasingly favoured monetization of capital accumulation through the trading of fictitious capital rather than the commitment of money capital to the much harder processes of material transformation in manufacturing.
Yeah, really interesting. And would you say this is sort of, it seems to be quite linked to, I guess, the removal of financial controls, the removal of sort of trade frictions, and the increase in globalization, this concentration of capital in the financial market. So do you see there being a link between those trends?
Well, the issue here, people focus a lot about on the movement of capital, right? And as I described earlier, some capital did relocate its activities outside of the United States, where it sought opportunities to grow profits or to sustain profit rates in lower cost operating environments. So that is one dimension of global mobility of capital. The other dimension, which has been structurally in the interest of the United States finance capital sector, has been the ability for global capital, particularly accumulated US dollars through the US running persistent trade deficits, to find its way back into the United States. And much of that has found its way back through the markets of essentially finance capital or fictitious capital, as I said, whether it's bonds, stocks, derivatives, foreign exchange, and those kind of instruments and markets for those kind of instruments. So capital flows has enabled the United States to expand a financialized sector in ways that also at the same time undermined the relative contributions of the non-financial sectors to the economy. 50 years on, there is now clearly a dose of regret that the United States economic model is not delivering in ways that at least certain sections of the political strata and big sections of the population at large would hope it to. And the aim is to try to revitalize those sectors of the economy that people see as having been left to sort of wallow on the sidelines as finance became dominant. As I've mentioned, to do that, you've actually got to have a proper diagnosis of why those problems exist. And until the United States policy-making machinery can come to grips with the effects of financialization, much else will be largely window dressing.
Yeah, and I guess it's a vicious cycle because the world needs dollars and more debt and more collateral for the current system. And if the US doesn't want to give it to them for one reason or another, it seems like this could collapse quite quickly.
Well, the question as to why the world needs dollars is an interesting one, right? So, why does the world need dollars? Well, fundamentally, the world uses dollars as a means of payment for cross-border trade is actually the first real reason why the world needed dollars. And in the years after the Second World War, the world needed dollars because most of the capital goods that the world needed for economic redevelopment and post-war reconstruction purposes happened to be available only from the United States. That is, of course, for the economies that weren't connected to the Soviet Union, right? So the United States dollar was a necessary means of payment if you were interested in accessing technologies and capital goods that you needed for your own economic development and infrastructure development. The issue today is whether or not the United States economy continues to fulfill that role within the global setting. And given the discussion that's happening about the hollowing out of American manufacturing and industrial capacity, it is quite clear that, in fact, the United States economic system does not any longer occupy the position of being largely the monopoly supplier of capital goods and other forms of equipment and technologies that the world needs for its development. Put plainly, the demand for, or the reasons for historic demand for US dollars are no longer as strong today as they once were. So, why else are US dollars in demand? That's really the question. And this tariffs regime that the President Trump 2.0 is pursuing, I think, has the real potential of lifting the lid on these questions, and the developing world in particular are coming rapidly to the realization that for their own development aspirations, which requires access to raw materials, know-how, technologies, and capital goods, you simply don't need US dollars to mobilize those.
Yeah, and I guess that links to the size of the market and the amount of demand that they have for imports from other countries, which they're trying to shift. So I think China's trade surplus with the US is, it's almost a third of their overall trade surplus. I think it's over $300 billion
Yeah, but
annually.
you got to keep all of this in proportionate context, right? And the reality is that the United States as a market today represents about 15% of global trade. 6 years ago, it represented 20% of global trade. That's not to say that the US market's shrinking. It's to say that the rest of the global market for trade is growing faster than the US market is. So, in relative terms, the US market is actually falling as far as its significance to global trade is concerned. The second issue goes to the China trade question. Similarly, the US market is no longer as important to China's exporters, relatively speaking, as it once was. The US market occupies 16.5 to 17% of China's export market these days, and that's down substantially from the heydays in the mid 2000s. So again, the significance of the US market in relative terms compared to the significance of other markets, including China's own domestic market, I might add, is diminishing and diminishing quite rapidly. Now, in many regards, this tells us a few things. Firstly, that the United States is no longer as important an economy globally as it once was. But secondly, in large part, the ambitions, the implied ambitions, if you will, from the Trump administration, which is to reduce American dependency on global supply chains, may well actually be what's happening quite naturally anyway. So, in relative terms, the United States is actually buying relatively less from the world than it once did, and the world is less dependent upon the United States market as it once was. The trick for the United States, though, isn't just in aggregate numerical terms, which is what the balance of payments questions often focus upon, but the qualitative dimensions of what it is that it continues to import. And this is where the United States does have some risk exposures. it doesn't make a lot of the things that it needs in terms of capital equipment and technologies to rejuvenate manufacturing. So if its ambition is to rejuvenate manufacturing, by which I mean a modern manufacturing sector, which is heavily mechanized and automated, then inevitably the United States will need to import a lot of the capital equipment. Whether it imports it from China or from Chinese firms manufacturing elsewhere or from Germany and Japan will be a matter that perhaps the marketplace will resolve, or perhaps it'll be a combination of the marketplace plus discretionary public policies from the US. But the point here is that the United States has risk exposures that other nations actually don't. And they're the challenges that the US now faces as it actively implements policies that will reduce the extent to which it can actually interact with the rest of the world.
Yeah, it seems to be a trend similar to what China went through in 2018, where recently spoke to Louis Vincent Gave, who was talking about this, how, the tariffs on semiconductors, they realized, like, wow, that, if they do it on this, they can do it on everything. We need to be self-sufficient in everything we do. And that's sort of how we've seen this massive emergence of the manufacturing
Well,
economy.
this actually happened well before, right? Perhaps the crystallization for those viewing the world from the outside was that 2018 was a pivotal moment. But in fact, if you go back to the public policy discussions in China from the early 2010s, there was already an emerging recognition that there was a need to become more capable domestically to meet its own expansion requirements, not only because of risks emerging from geopolitical events, but also in terms of purely sort of technical supply chain risks as far as the ability to logistically service the growing demands of the Chinese economy. And you'll recall that in 2015, the Made in China 2025 plan was released, which actually bookended, if you will, the Chinese public policy response to what the nation, through its national policy making processes, identified as its strategic development priorities. And obviously, come 2018, the imposition of tariffs and export controls, in many regards, crystallized those assessments coming from Beijing. And I guess the rest is history. So rather than seeing the imposition of tariffs and export controls as fundamentally driving the end of something, which in some ways you could view it as that, it's also worth viewing it as just another part of the processes of ongoing transformation and change in the ways in which nations interact with each other and the ways in which their domestic economic structures continue to evolve. So change is the constant here. And rather than lamenting the demise of what once was, we need to be focused on how it is that nations are in a position to adapt and adjust to this evolving landscape.
Okay. Yeah, really interesting to hear. And obviously the Chinese economy has sort of shifted. It's, exporting more of these, I guess, more technical products globally. Does this mean that it's at a greater risk of, I guess, external factors such as sort of recessions in Europe and the US and other countries, or?
Well, the evolution of the Chinese economic model has seen the Chinese model actually become less export dependent than it once was. This is actually the reality. So in the mid 2000s, 5 years after China was admitted to the World Trade Organization, its manufactured exports to output ratios peaked at 23% or thereabouts. It's actually come back now quite substantially. And notwithstanding the recent spike in Chinese exports, particularly of manufacturers, in large part as a result of the structural changes in Russia's trading profile, which created an economic market that, for all intents and purposes, wasn't it wasn't available at the scale that it became available for Chinese exporters. Chinese manufactured exports to output had dropped to under 20%. Interestingly, I might add that the US manufacturing exports to output ratio is higher than China's export to output ratio, meaning that American manufacturers as a whole is actually more export dependent than Chinese manufacturers. So that's the first thing to bear in mind. But the flip side of all of that is that, in fact, the Chinese domestic market continues to play an ever increasing role in the absorption of China's growing outputs. Right? So that's the second point to actually remember. So that's the flip side. And we see that in sectors such as electric vehicles, where the Chinese domestic market in 2024 absorbed around 90% of all outputs. And this is in a year where outputs continue to grow to new record levels. So Chinese domestic demand is growing as well. Right? So Chinese output growth is actually, proportionately speaking, not as dependent upon export markets as it once was 20 years ago, for example. The beauty for the world, particularly in product categories where capital intensivity, know-how, etc., are required to achieve high quality, low cost output, the developing world markets actually gain the benefit of having access to large volumes of low cost Chinese outputs now. So rather than being trapped in an economic model which dominated the world from 1945 to, say, 2005 to 2015, perhaps, where developing nations simply could not afford to access the sufficient quantity of capital goods and high technology products that they needed for their own development. China's expansion of its output to meet its own domestic needs, its growing domestic needs, is delivering to the world for the first time an abundance of these goods, and backed by intense domestic competition in the Chinese domestic market, these goods are being made available to both China and the global markets at historically unprecedented low prices. So China, in effect, is pricing people in through abundance, which transforms the global economic model from what dominated in the past, which was a situation in which most enterprises and peoples around the world continued to be priced out through confected scarcity.
It does seem to be that there must be a limit, though, similar, I guess, to the infrastructure building that we saw, probably in the early 2000s and before that, and then this is sort of expansion, this high version of manufacturing. It can't, in my opinion, it probably can't go forever because margins just keep getting, smaller and smaller, and then it becomes unprofitable.
Well, the question is, what does forever mean, right? So, but if you look at infrastructure globally, there are still many parts of the world that require transport and energy infrastructure as well as water infrastructure for the basic foundations of a moderately high quality standard of living. So globally speaking, there is still actually a substantial infrastructure gap to enable, many billions of people in the world to experience the standards of living that most people in the West have taken for granted. That's the first thing. The second thing to bear in mind is that infrastructure investments by their very nature are lumpy and have long lifespans, which means their economic impacts are felt for many, many generations. And without that infrastructure being put into place, people simply cannot participate in the circuits and networks of capital accumulation that underpins economic development. So it's one thing for people to talk about how infrastructure development has been, quote, wasteful, unquote, but they refuse to recognize that without this infrastructure, people and the products and the goods that they produce are simply not connected to what other people are doing and therefore can't participate in these circuits of accumulation. You've got to have infrastructure for economic development to take place. And China has provided that, not only for itself, but also in many other parts of the world. We are going to start to see, of course, an evolution of the kinds of infrastructure that will need to be implemented. And that kind of infrastructure is going to hinge heavily on the infrastructure for the digital world. And I'm talking about not only the physical aspects of undersea cables, server farms, switching equipment, satellites, and other forms of wireless technologies, but also the software and applications that ultimately make it possible for information to be stored and to be transported quickly to enable rapid decision making. And these are the kinds of infrastructures that I think we can start to anticipate being part of the next phase of global infrastructure development. So China itself still has quite a lot of infrastructure to go. If you spend a bit of time outside of the big cities in China and you get into the third tiers and fourth tiers of China, and then into the countryside, you'll realize that there is still considerable amounts of infrastructure shortages, whether it's in roads and other forms of transport connectivity, as well as in electrification infrastructure, water infrastructure, and ultimately information infrastructure.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. As you said, there's always more to do, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on, I guess, DeepSeek. And there was quite a surprise to markets last week, and I think it shows you that despite some of the barriers and limitations that have been put on China, it's found ways around it, and that's sometimes the side effect of these tariffs, that you can actually, China has to be software dependent, have to try and do what they can with less, basically, currently.
Well, as they say, necessity is the mother of invention,
Mm.
and the imposition of various forms of restrictions on China, particularly by the Biden administration, but ones which started prior to the Biden administration, clearly created an environment in which smart people, clever and creative people, put their minds to finding answers given the constraints that they faced. And DeepSeek is one of the examples by which the constraints acted actually as the catalyst to leaps of innovative discovery that will lead to fundamental transformations in the economic models that will be available for enterprises, communities, individuals, and nation states going forward. In the AI space, there was for some time a belief that the United States in particular was the natural leader, with significant monies committed through venture capital and private equity to a small number of AI ventures, which led the world and captured global public attention. We can only think of the buzz that came about when ChatGPT became publicly available and people around the world began to experience the capabilities of this generation of artificial intelligence. Now, doing that project and continuing to deliver that particular project has been and will continue to be an expensive endeavor, both at a hardware level and also in terms of the energy costs that have been consumed to enable the AI to be trained and for the AI functionalities to be made available to people, to users around the world. That particular model has also been made possible because it has promised investors, after it abandoned the idea of being a not-for-profit, it promised investors a return on investment that would be premised on the ability for OpenAI, the parent company of ChatGPT, to secure what is in effect a market-leading or even a market-dominating position, enabling it to garner economic rents. By economic rents, I mean above average profits, and profits based on revenues that are substantially higher than the marginal cost of delivering the services itself. You touched on earlier this issue of diminishing returns and reducing profit rates. Well, I think we're going to start to see that impact very substantially in the heretofore mainstream AI business model. And the reason we're going to see that is that DeepSeek has demonstrated two things. One is that it is possible to achieve comparable, if not superior, performance outcomes at substantially less capital costs and operating costs, number one. And number two, by making available its core model as an open source resource, means that anyone in the world, provided that they have the foundational know-how to do so, are now able to implement and adapt a DeepSeek model-based AI capability in their own environments at negligible operating expenses as well, whereby the DeepSeek model itself is available free of charge. This makes AI a very, very low cost public goods infrastructure, which is entirely at odds with the proprietary based models that US venture capital and private equity backed AI projects had relied upon for their business cases. This is a fundamental change in the business models that are available to people across the world to access the possibilities and the opportunities of this technology.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing what it's able to do. And I guess, how does an open source software work in the Chinese economy?
Well, Chinese enterprises, interestingly, over the last half a dozen years or so at least, have become far more active in the open source ecosystem in various domains than many American organizations. Open source has been around a long time, for many decades, in fact, and emerged largely out of the libertarian dimensions of technology development in the 1970s and 1980s, which saw in technology the possibilities of wider economic democratization. The problem was that the open source environment was in large part pushed to the edge world of enthusiasts and hobbyists as large corporations began developing and rolling out, and through their resourcing, able to secure a footprint across, firstly, American society for their proprietary models, and in time to extend the American big tech model to become what was tantamount to the global big tech model. Open source, however, never went away, and the enthusiasts in the open source environment kept the flame alight, and Chinese enterprises, and not just Chinese enterprises, but in large part because of the heft that Chinese enterprises brought to the open source world, they've been able to take the broad open source ethos to another level. And that next level has been all about quality and scale of implementation that delivered outcomes and performance that matched the best of the proprietary systems. And that is the transformation that has taken place. Open source is a pivotal piece of the architecture for a future in which digital sovereignty at a national level and at other levels can play an increasingly prominent role in the affairs of societies, economies, and countries at large.
Yeah, it does seem like a major shift of China into sort of, and I know it was a corporation within the country, but it is soft power. It seems to be sort of a shift into that.
Well, it certainly enables people around the world to do things, right, with technologies that perhaps they would not have been able to do because it would have been cost prohibitive otherwise. Now, that is transformational, and if there are soft power benefits of that, then I'm sure the folk in Beijing, won't say no to that. But putting aside, those questions of soft power, I think the real issue is how this drives forward the transformation of the global economic model that sees it progressively and perhaps at greater pace transformed from one in which peripheral nations, the developing nations of the world, were always at the beck and call of the countries that dominated the technology frontiers of economic systems. And this particular configuration, this center periphery configuration, has progressively been undermined and perhaps through DeepSeek has been turned on its head.
And is that a great, I guess, analogy to what we're seeing in the global economic order in general?
Well, I think it's just change, right? I mean, and the change is for the best part of 500 years, the global economic system has largely revolved around, single dominating centers, and those centers have, through a combination of control over technologies, control over militaries, and control over finances, have secured wealth from peripheral parts of the world to the economic and political elite in the centers of the world. That model is changing. That model is transforming, in part because of the spreading out, if you will, of trading relationships, so that the centrality of the US economy to global trade, which was the case until a few decades ago, has now diminished substantially. Obviously, China has in large part become the most significant trading country in the world and is also the world's most significant industrial economy. But in doing that, it hasn't been able to, and I don't think structurally it can in any regards, replace the US in terms of one economic hegemon replacing another economic hegemon. And that's because the United States economy will continue to be an important economy in the world. It's not a small economy. The United States isn't going to go away, and I don't think that anybody who is relatively sane would suggest that the United States economy is going to collapse tomorrow. But what we are seeing is the emergence of multiple key centers of economic heft and technology development and capability. And that means that the configuration of global economic contours is undergoing transformation, of which these features are symptomatic, but is also going to drive towards a model that looks more like a complex neural network rather than an economic model in which you have a clear center and periphery sets of relationships.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, Warwick, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. We've touched on so many different topics. But my last question is, what is one message you want people to take away from our conversation?
Look, it's easy to get worked up about the normative merits of the actions of different countries, but and that's fair enough too. Actually, people will have views about this. But what I guess I try to do is take half a step back and say, look, let's actually just, in the first instance, try to understand the dynamics of change and what is happening in terms of change, rather than seeing change as somehow taking us towards an end destination. We simply need to understand that change is ever present. Sometimes it feels like it's happening quicker and in a greater extent than at other times. But what's important for people around the world is to appreciate the nature of those changes, the trajectory of those changes, and how those changes ultimately impact upon the opportunities for improvements in the quality of life for people around the world, and how people ultimately can adapt to those changes. So rather than reach for black and white judgments about whether changes are good or bad, and good for so-and-so and bad for so-and-so, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to realize that there is both good and bad in change, but the key is how we are able to adapt to change and not lose sight of the fact that change brings with it both opportunities as well as risks. And the challenge for us as humanity, as individuals and as communities, is to harness change in ways that can deliver better outcomes for people and better outcomes for the planet.
Yeah, great message. So, Warwick, thanks again. If anyone wanted to find out more about your work and what you do, where would the best places for that be?
Probably the best place is Substack. So Warwick Powell is my name, and that's the name on my Substack as well. I post notes there pretty much every day, which are a little bit extended, but not too long. And every 10 days or so, I try to also publish a slightly longer essay discussing some of the contemporary themes. In doing so, what I try to avoid, Anthony, is providing, I guess, a blow-by-blow commentary. There's lots of great observers and analysts who do that, but try to take not a big step back, but just half a step back, and contextualize what's going on in the world and help people think about it with a framework that I hope will empower people to think imaginatively about the possibilities of these changes and how they themselves can adapt to them.
Yeah, great point. It's easy to get stuck in the day to day and not take that step back to actually analyze how it impacts us. But yeah, I'll put that in the description below. But thanks again for your time.
Absolute pleasure.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening. I really appreciate the support. If you've got value out of this, I'd really appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, or comment. You know, good or bad feedback. I'm always open to that. But it really helps with the channel. As I said before, only about 14% of people actually subscribe to this channel. So if you were to that, it would really help. It could mean we could continue to grow. If not, thanks for watching and see you on the next show. And you also might like this video right here. All right, thanks again.